and thank you, Nash, for introducing that. We met 10 years ago.
Yeah.
In a cab on the way to Wayne State University.
Wayne State University. That's right.
So, so it's been that long. But thank you for inviting me. As I said, I'm Chris Marcum. I do work at the National Human Genome Research Institute. But I'll note that I'm actually in the social network methods section there. So I'm doing social science in a really biomedical research entity. I work very closely there with Laura Cayley. She actually heads this section, is in fact the branch chief now. And so we have this long and standing collaboration together. However, today I won't be talking about the work I do with Laura. I'll be talking about a different set of studies that I think that you'll find quite interesting. It's titled An Ego-Centric Relational Events Model of Buffet Selection Processes in Experimental Virtual Reality Settings. I probably should have come up with a more parsimonious title, but I thought this would be at least exact. I want to say, first of all, thank you all for hosting me. Thanks to Nosh for inviting me, particularly Megan and Eric. You guys have done a great job hosting me. Just had some really great conversations. So thanks for filling my day with just great conversations and chats, and I hope to continue some of those during dinner. So a little bit about NIH. So NHGRI, the Human Genome Research Institute, is one of only 3 ICs that have social and behavioral science. So NCI, NIA, and NHGRI. All of the others, even NICHD, for example, doesn't have an intramural research program specifically designed around social behavioral science. Okay? So it's kind of unique. All right, so because I work in a large biomedical firm, and because, as Nash said, there are lots of governmental rules, I have to disclose all my conflicts of interest. As you can see, there are lots of them. No, I'm only doing this because I like this group and I admire the work that you do at Sonic. But I've got some housekeeping things, and the very first one I have to note is that I mentioned that I'm not working with Laura Cayley on this project. Instead, I'm actually working with Dr. Susan Persky, who is the head of a virtual reality unit that we use to do experiments at the NIH, okay, with patient population as well as healthy population. Dr. Colin McBride, who's sort of the visionary for the study that we're going to be looking at today. We're looking at a virtual buffet simulation that she designed, an intervention she designed. And and Susan's really talented postbac fellow, who's among applying to graduate school currently, she's also been doing some of the modeling and lit review that is motivating this work. And I want to also mention very briefly that this project has IRB approval in IH, so it's all ethically cleared. And importantly, the research I'm going to present to you is work in progress. Okay, so we're at the very basic stages of both understanding what's going on in the data, but also from a theoretical perspective, how we're building our model, what we're trying to test, what we're trying to accomplish. And so the results in the model that I'm going to present to you today is really our first attempt, okay, the first set of results, and it can be improved before we reach out for publication. And I thought that it would be nice in this forum to present this really to solicit some feedback, first of all, but also to sort of allow myself really an opportunity to really get into the data with a nice deadline of this talk. So at the end of the talk, we can sort of discuss what that means moving forward. And so now I want to mention here that Dr. McBride and Dr. Persky are the experts in eating behavior and obesity in this team. I was brought on for methodological reasons, okay, and because I'm a modeler, a behaviorist and a modeler, but I am not an expert in either eating processes or obesity, but it would be a disservice, I think, to both my collaborators and the NIH if I didn't talk to you for a few minutes, at least about some of the underlying problems of obesity in U.S. families that motivate this research. Okay, so we'll start with that. I'll then talk about the virtual buffet simulation, which I think you'll find kind of interesting. This is where the Mother's Take study that Colleen McBride designed and is implemented by Susan really comes in. So the Mother's Take is this virtual buffet simulation where we recruit people to come in and put headgear on. I'll show you in a moment. It's pretty fun. I'll talk about the main outcomes from that past research, okay? Only to the extent that they motivate what we're doing here in this talk, okay? And what we're doing is we're going to use the relational events framework as a model for choice selection, okay? So not really in an econometric sense, but in a behavioral sense. And I'll talk to you, if you're not familiar with relational events model and relational events framework, a little bit about that. I have some results that I think are really nice. They sort of illustrate the problem as well as some of the challenges moving forward. And I'll discuss that in terms of model fit and where I think we're headed next. Okay, so it's probably no surprise to any of you, okay, that obesity in the United States, okay, prevalence among adults anyway, has been going up since the 60s. Okay, this is typical USA Today news. This is data from NHANES and the CDC. When we're really talking in terms of the prevalence, that we've got about 30% of US adults who are at least clinically, in the clinical sense, obese, 70% overweight in the US. And that statistic has sort of risen from the past, where in the 1960s we're looking at around 10% overweight. Now, what's interesting about this is that 10 to 15% of U.S. children, so young kids, are clinically obese. Okay, so this is a population level problem, it's a public health concern. Why is that a public health concern? It wouldn't be a health concern unless it was associated with disease. And in fact, obesity is a major risk factor for lots of things, but the ones that we're interested in at the NIH are heart disease, hypertension, stroke, type 2 diabetes, and even certain cancers, certain lipid cancers. Now, all that said and done, those diseases represent the leading non-accident causes of preventable death in the U.S. Okay, so we're really motivated to understand both from a disease perspective, but also from an economic expenditures perspective, because it's at great cost. It's of great cost to both society and personal cost if you have to manage an obesity-related condition. Now, it's also no surprise, right, that the underlying risk factors and indeed the causes of obesity are well understood. Okay, they're known and well understood, right? It's an imbalance in your personal caloric to input to output ratio, along with some genetic factors. Okay, and we're at the Human Genome Research Institute, and so we're really in social and behavioral science interested in genetic factors that we can account for through family health history. Okay, and so there's an imbalance in caloric intake and genetic factors that might magnify your propensity for developing or becoming obese or inhibit it. So there's some people who have metabolic rates that are much faster than others. But what's interesting about this is that these three factors, okay, are relevant to parents of children. So these are family relevant factors because parents are largely, hopefully, I'm a new parent, so I'm learning this, involved in meal planning, recreation, and they are the keepers of family health history, so they're the ones who know what their own risks are. It's also important from family health history perspective because even though family health history captures both genetic and environmental effects, the joint effects are rising from mom and from dad are going to influence child's health, behavior, and health risk more than just, say, their own behavior. Okay. So this isn't all doom and gloom, right? So for many kids, especially those in the worst or most risky set, poor kids, okay, obesity rates in recent years, so over between 2008 and 2012, have actually decreased in most locations. Okay, so it's not all doom and gloom. I still want to point out that for toddlers, for preschool kids, we have about 12.5% clinical diagnosis. So it's a big problem. 12.5% is a large chunk of the population. And so why is this a problem? Well, 12.5%, right? Those kids grow up. And the largest risk factor for becoming obese as an adult is being obese as a child. All right? So we think, and this is Colleen McBride's theory, is that if we intervene during childhood, okay, we can't really intervene on the kids themselves, right? But we can influence through communication processes, through information processes, and recommendations, the dietary and recreational choices that families, okay, in this case we're looking at moms, okay, that moms may make on behalf of their children. And why we want to do that? We want to curb this sort of high risk factor. We want to stop obesity before it develops in childhood. Okay, so that's where the Mother's Take study comes in. Now, Mother's Take study, I can't actually remember the acronym off the top of my head, but it's something like risk assessment. It's a acronym for risk assessment. And what they propose is that they can leverage risk information to help shape overweight mothers, so these are overweight mothers, already overweight, family meal decisions. Okay? And what they did is they recruited 230 overweight mothers who have children that are preschool age, age 4 to 5, and they did this in 2010. 221 of them were screened into the study, and they were randomized to receive either information about food safety as a control. So it's just general information about the temperature you can cook food at, what is a balanced diet, information that is unrelated to obesity per se, but it's just general information about obesity. Behavioral risk information, so what leads from a behavior perspective in terms of recreation, okay, or energy, exercise, and diet to obesity, or what can prevent obesity, what can prevent, they don't call it obesity, they call it a healthy weight. Or family health history risk assessment personalized to that mother, okay, and that child, focused on the child, plus the behavioral risk assessment. So there's two things combined. And that family health history information, I'll show you an example of it in a minute, gives them both a qualitative and quantitative perspective of what they can expect their risk to be given to their child that they inherited. This is also environmental effects, right, through their family health history. Okay? And each one of these is a packet of information that they received both to take home, but they also sat in the lab and read through this information with a counselor with them, so to help understand. And I'll show you a flow chart in a minute that explains that. So mothers then participated at a follow-up in a virtual reality buffet simulation where they walked through a buffet and picked a typical meal for their child. Okay? And the main outcome from that study were the calories and the nutritional content of the meal that they selected at the end of the simulation. They didn't care about what went on in the simulation at all. They just want to know how many calories they picked. Okay? So here's a walkthrough. So I want to point out a couple of things in this. This is your typical NIH and IRB flow chart for assessment. Here are the randomization. So after they screened in, they came into the lab and they did a practice buffet session. Okay, so we wanted to get them accustomed to what it was like to be immersed in a virtual environment that I'll show you in a moment, before they came back and actually were assigned to the experiment. And we did that to control out for sort of novelty effects that might filter into the experiment. They were then randomized to receive either food safety control, the BRI, or the BRI plus the FHH risk assessment conditions. They came back to the NIH. Okay, they're given a at that moment they're given a information assessment to determine whether or not they understood the information that they were given, and they were allowed a chance to reconcile confusion about that information. So we really want them to really understand what we give them. They came back at follow-up and then conducted the experiment in the simulation, and then had a post assessment as follow-up and a third wave. Okay, so 2 buffet simulations: practice and the experiment. Okay? Keep that in the back of your mind. So the FHH data, there's a lot of research that shows that people don't understand genetic or family health history risk. They just don't get it, the general population. You tell someone that they have a 5 times likelihood of developing a particular disease, they think that they're certainly going to develop that disease. It's very there's a lot of ambiguity about what this means. So we tried our best to present information in a variety of formats that helps them understand what the risk meant. And so here's one example of the types of information that was in that FHH module. So here, if they have one overweight parent, so everybody here has at least one overweight parent because mom is by design overweight. But you can see that they were shown, okay, here's where your child is in this group. So your child has this level of risk. And then if they have 2 overweights, you have about a 50% chance, or over 50% chance of becoming obese as adults here. Okay. So this type of information is what they're presented, and at time 1 and then at time 2, they donned their headgear. Okay. Here's their headgear. This is not one of our moms. This is an assessment. Here's one of the lab spaces that we have. We have three of these lab spaces. And when they're in there, it's a really well-developed, I don't know if you can you see this okay? Yeah. Really well-developed virtual environment that they had built. It's fully immersive, so you look down, you see the tiles on the floor, you look up, you see the ceiling lights, you look out the window, you can see there's some cars back there. This is actually looking out away from the buffet. Each of the food stuff is nicely labeled, okay, you know what it is, and it's relatively appealing, okay, it's not completely gross looking, it's not, you don't have this uncanny valley issues with food, although I think there are some going on. And so the environment really is designed to sort of mimic a typical buffet experience. This is an empirically informed design. Here's another perspective. This is looking into the buffet as they had entered the experiment. This little clicker here, okay, so what you can't see is that she's holding a tray. If the person looked down, you see she has a tray with a plate, and she's going to use that clicker. So it's in her hand here. This is the virtual manifestation of that clicker to select the food. So it's like her hand, okay? If she does that, it actually it looks like she's picking up a spoon and spooning food in, okay? You'll see that there's a teller down here, okay? And so what happens is in this environment, they go through their food selection process, they get a meal, and then to get out of the simulation, they have to interact with the teller. Okay, so they just, here, I want to pay for my food. They pay for the food. And of course, they have practice sessions, so they know how to do that. Okay, so what are the main findings? Well, first of all, mothers who were given behavior, this is the main outcome paper, mothers who were given the behavioral risk information plus the FHH plates. Okay? They made plus FHH made plates with significantly fewer calories than those who were randomized to control. Okay? So the FHH is doing something. So they receive the FHH at time 1, they do the experiment at time 2, and it's having this long-term impact on.
Chris, can I ask a quick
Yes.
question? Did you all do manipulation checks? Because you said that this material was a little difficult to do. So was there any evidence that they were actually picking up what was in these?
Yes, so they actually did a test. So that post-assessment test, we wanted to assure that they understood what the information was. Perfect. Yeah, good question. But here's the interesting part, is that if they were given just behavior recommendations, okay, behavioral risk information, so basically telling people that they lead an unhealthy lifestyle does not differ from control, from the food safety. So you tell how bad you're doing, and that's not going to change their behavior. But if you say, hey, some of the cause of your condition is out of your control, you inherited it, it actually shapes what they're doing. So this is the primary hypothesis of this study, and indeed they find this. But there's something really bizarre going on, in that the risk feedback conditions, either BRI or BRI plus FHH, they didn't result in any aversion to less healthy food choices. Okay, so they're just selecting fewer calories. They're not selecting any healthier food. They're still picking the mac and cheese and the brownies. They're just picking less of them. Okay, so there wasn't any real shift in the food's nutritional content, but only the caloric. So they actually asked, presenting this research, and I was in the audience, they really wanted to know to what extent does the behavioral process differ between feedback and control? They want to know what's going on in the simulation that might lead to this sort of end of the plate, this plate at the end of the simulation. What's going on? Are they actually behaving differently based on the feedback conditions? These models behaving differently. And so I said, well, I can do that. I can use the relational events framework for social action to actually create a model of the entire event history in that simulation for every mother. And so, what is the relational events framework for social action? Well, I'm going to dispel some myths in case some of you may be familiar with this, some of you may be working on these problems. The relational events framework, first and foremost, is not a single model. Okay, this has been a mischaracterization that some folks have said in the lit. It is not one thing. It is a family of models, and it is a framework for modeling behavior. Okay? It was behavior in time, so dynamic behavior. It was originally developed by Carter Butts to model dyadic events unfolding on a network in real time or in ordinal time, so two different likelihoods here. And what do I mean by that? Well, I send Nosh communication, Nosh sends Megan a communication, Megan might turn around and send Nosh or ask me a question. So it gets at that underlying process that gives rise to what we might consider a network. Okay. However, this is kind of subtle, all right? While it was originally developed to model a set of action types, okay, directed from a set of senders, actors, to a set of receiver actors, okay, we said, you know what? We can model any sequence of events where the temporal order or the exact timing information is preserved in this way. So Carter and I generalized this to what we're going to call ego-centric cases, where only one individual actor's behavior is monitored. Okay? And so as long as they have a series of events with a series of event types, we can model that in this framework. We can also incorporate exogenous events, so things can happen. So you can imagine that you're in this virtual world, right? And a collaborator has to say, hey, turn around. Well, the mother is, right? The mother didn't instantiate that. She didn't do anything to cause that. The collaborator, that's an exogenous event. We can incorporate that in the models. And the likelihood follows like this. It's quite nice. So it just says that the probability, okay, of an event history, AT, given a vector of parameters and some sufficient statistics, can be modeled as a product of the likelihoods of all the events that happened up to that time that are endogenous, okay, times everything that could possibly have happened up that time but didn't, and only those that are happening, this last term here, only those events that have happened up to the end of observation. Okay? So this just says, I can specify a set of action types, okay, and a set of timing information, and given that if I just walk through, I can get the relative rates that everything happens, and then I can model any sequence or subsequence of those events as statistics. So what does that mean for the model? Well, first of all, we assume that there's a latent piecewise constant hazard model that governs the relative rates, okay, of one event to another, so the amount of time. What that says is that the inter-event times are exponentially distributed. Okay, what does that mean? Well, that means that we can't have any simultaneous events because there's a zero probability of simultaneity in the exponential world. Okay, things can't happen at once. And in this case, you couldn't pick two things at once, so this is a reasonable assumption. Okay, it also means that we can only observe events. Okay, all the events have to occur within the observation period. Well, start of simulation, end of simulation, you meet that condition here. And it has this really nice parametric form. Okay, where we can model the hazards of the event history basically in an exponential world. Okay, so this is a lot like Cox proportional hazard model, but a whole mixture of them. So for every event type, you have a mixture of models. And all this is a set of base rates, the hazards for base rates, plus vector parameters times the vector of sufficient statistics for that action type, and any statistics on that action type, up to and including everything that could have happened in the past, AT. Okay? So it's a nice, very comfortable, very contained likelihood. So here, unlike the original formulation where you have centers and seeders and action types, all we have are a set of action types. Okay? And what are those? Well, those are the food selection choices in the buffet. Very simple. We can actually use this as an approximation for a mixed method multiple choice model. Okay?
So this is no longer relational events, it's just events.
So I'm going to point something out. If you can think of it this way.
Bipartite.
Yeah, there we go. So you can actually think of this, and I forget who mentioned bipartite. Yeah, so you can think of this as a relational event model for a bipartite network. Except that what we're doing here, okay, is that we're going to pool the likelihood for all the actors. Okay, so it's like a multiple, fully mixed bipartite network. Yeah, exactly. So this would be the exact equivalent of saying you've got a set of actors and a set of choices, and you want to model the endogeneity of the process going on from one actor choosing those, making those selections over time. Very good. Okay, so from the buffet data, we get all actions are recorded in real time, and each mother, generates an event history of the behavior in the buffet world, bipartite network. Here we can see what's going on. This is a bird's eye view. This is not a view that you would get if you were in the buffet. I just programmed this with POV to get this perspective so you can actually see all the choices that they could make. And also to show that there is real structure here, okay? So I'm going to generate a set of sufficient statistics from this model. I'm going to build a model, okay, that's going to be subsequences of events that transpire in time with some covariates. So we have covariates here. And that we're going to model those events jointly. And as I mentioned before, it's going to be a fully mixed model. So this isn't a hierarchical model. It's fully Bayesianly mixed. Okay, and we're going to accomplish that using maximum a posteriori methods. So, case of the effects here, we're going to get posterior modes. We have a weakly informative prior. We don't think that things can just randomly happen. There's going to be some propensity for things to happen a priori. We can talk about that at the end if you like. So, what's interesting about this buffet simulation, okay, and how I'm going to build this model, is I actually think that, yes, there might be behavioral things going on, okay, but I'm a sociologist, I'm a mathematical sociologist, I think about social structure, And in part, I think about how the built environment influences our behavior. Okay? Here, we've got some features of the built. So here's a little cartoon. Actually, it's not a cartoon. This is an actual one of the shorter event histories that you see. So she starts here. She selects some mac and cheese. She gets some tater tots, some green beans. I don't know what this mush is. And then takes a drink and then exits. But we can see that there's a couple of things going on, a couple of features of this environment that are going on. First of all, there are clear ordering properties, right? So there's a spatial ordering of the foods, both from left to right and up and down, right? Drinks are fixed down at the bottom here, right next to the cash register, so that might be important about the relative hazard for selecting a drink, right? And also, something that you can't tell from this slide, but the portion size, here, these are child-adjusted portion sizes. So the spoon, every time you put it to the plate, it's a very small portion, okay? So that might cause some things to happen in terms of their behavior, okay? So I'll talk about that in a moment. So let's build a model. What do I want to do? Well, first of all, I think, okay, that certain foods are more attractive than others. These foods might be more attractive than these, or vice versa. So I want to set up some pacing constants for the hazard of selecting each food separately. Because these are like intercept terms for every single food choice. This just gives us the overall rate at which any particular choice is favored. Okay? And then I'm going to have 10 behavioral terms, and we'll walk through them, that are a combination of sequence and covariance statistics that are going to model what we think from the literature that should theoretically differ based on the feedback conditions. What are the behavioral processes that you do that might be different to influence, that might be influenced by the feedback, the risk conditions. And then we're going to have 3 structural terms that are going to model behaviors that arise from the design of the buffet itself, the virtual world's constraints. To look at the differences from feedback conditions, we're going to have 60 statistics here, okay, that are going to be first differences between the two feedback conditions and the rest of these things for the control group. Okay, so these are just first differences. It's a big interaction model. If you're doing the math, you'll note that the final largest model we'll look at will have 90 terms. Okay, it's a complex model. It's actually easy to fit. So we have some hypotheses, not completely theoretical. We actually believe strongly that there are going to be both behavioral and structural processes influencing the choice selection going on. So we think that a priori is going to happen. Why? Well, because people behave, right? They didn't just arrive at a plate. There has to be things going on. This is sort of a null hypothesis here. We believe that the base rates will differ by feedback condition. Okay, so we think that certain foods might be more attractive based on the feedback condition they received. And we also think that the behavioral conditions, the behavioral statistics, are going to significantly differ by feedback condition, but not the structural ones. Why? Well, the structure is constant, right? Nothing has been changed, right? So every mother experiences the exact same environment. They shouldn't differ by feedback condition. Okay, so let's talk about the behavioral terms, because I think those are the more interesting ones. I'll walk through the ones we're going to select here. So you're going to note that I will refer to this guy, Wansink. He's up at Cornell. He's the expert, preeminent world expert in food buffet selection and food ordering problems. But he's noted that there's sort of 2 types of people in the world, and Megan Goldring, our postbac editor, brought this to our attention. And I noted, at the buffet today at the talk that I went to earlier, there's a buffet line. I actually watched people do this. There are browsers and non-browsers. Browsers is sort of conformist. So what is a browser? A browser is someone who's faced with the buffet. They don't immediately get in line, sort of move through the line of their plate. They actually look around, okay? They take their time, and then they make their food decision choices. Okay? I'm a browser. I do that. But we didn't actually have any question about whether or not a mother was a browser. But what we did have is their practice test. Okay, so their practice experiment. So we went back to the practice data, and we said, what if we discretize people into 2 groups, browsers and conformists, simply by looking at the distribution of waiting times to the first event in the practice session. So we don't want to do this endogenously. So we take the practice data and we say, okay, about 34 seconds. That's about where the 75th quantile is. If you're in that group from the practice session, we're going to count you as a browser in the trial. We operationalize this as a pair of pacing constants. So this is going to be additive terms to the base rate of selecting the next event. okay, that distinguish browsers' rates of healthy and unhealthy choices, because Wassink says, guess what? Browsers tend to have healthier BMI. So maybe they're making fewer, okay, think of it as a rate function, fewer unhealthy choices, or they're taking longer to make those unhealthy choices is another way of thinking about it. Yes?
So did you say conformers was the?
Yeah, he talks about browsers and like buffet conformists. So they get in and they just conform to the structure of the buffet.
Okay, but they're not conforming to like choices of other people in the buffet.
Well, they might, but we don't know why. Good. So we also had some work by Wilcox has shown that the presence, we have a mixture of healthy and unhealthy choices here. And this is actually contrary to Wassing's findings, that this is more recent, so I'm going from a recent one, that the presence of the presence of healthy foodstuffs in a mixture of healthy and unhealthy will actually drive people to make unhealthy choices later. Okay, so I'm like saving the best for last. I'm gonna get my salad and then a brownie. Okay, not gonna go to the brownie first. Okay, and this is over and above any food ordering effects. So we'll have one statistic in the model that just says they pick from this set of action types. Okay, and then the next thing that they do, okay, is pick from some sequence of these things. They pick from some sequence of these unhealthy choices. So they're making more indulgent choices later on in the event history. We also talked to some food experts about how people build plates in the absence of any environmental influences, and said, well, typically what they do is they pick a protein or a main course, they add a veg, a starch, and then we'll pick dessert last, and say, okay, well, that's a sequence, we can model that here. So here I'm going to add 6 statistics to the model that try to approximate that. Okay, so we have all the food choices that are in the main course protein entree group, all the veg, all the starches, and all the desserts. And then we can model not just the thing that we're interested in, that process at the top, but everything that is dependent upon that process giving rise. So controlling for the tendencies for these subsequences to occur, what's the likelihood that this thing occurs? Okay, so what's the rate function for that? And finally, for behavioral processes, okay, we've noted, and this actually comes out of that main finding paper, where it appeared that the food selection really wasn't differing by feedback condition all that much, but it seemed to be that people what's the alternative? They had to have been monitoring the serving size, right? That's the only way you can get rise to having. If you're not going to distinguish between what types of food you're going to select, the only thing you can be doing is monitoring the plate. So we can actually model this. And what we're going to do here is, and I'll talk about this in the end, I'm not happy with this operationalization. We're going to we're going to derive a statistic that captures the effect of the total past calories in the event history on the likelihood of selecting the next food, okay? So any next selection, so what is this doing, right? This is always a negative statistic, right? Because you can only accumulate calories, so it can only affect the rate by lowering the next thing that's going to happen, because at the end of the simulation, your plate is full. Okay? So this is really capturing the rate at which people fill their plate up. Okay? I'm not happy with it, but I'll talk about that in a moment. And the structural terms. These are less interesting, but I think they're important to discuss. There's a great deal of lit, and hats off to Wassing for really spearheading this. He really has shown that there are very strong effects of food ordering, portion size, as we suspected, and spatial location and configuration on buffet selection processes. The space really matters. You put foods first in line and then tell people to start in line. They will pick that food first with a higher rate than they pick any other food, even if they have a strong preference for the later foods. Okay? So the portion size effect, we're going to have it in what we're going to call portion size induced inertial effect. So this is due to the fact that these portion sizes are, child size. But this is an adult picking the meal, and even though it's a mom, okay, what happens, and we can see this empirically in the data, she gets a sample of peas, looks at her plate, says, oh, that's too small, gets another sample, So we think behaviorally, structurally, that's going on. Okay, so we're going to have one statistic in the model that models the likelihood that the next event is the same as the thing you just did. We'll have a global statistic for the partial ordering of the food as it's encountered in the buffet. So here we know the exact order with respect to both the left and the right side of the buffets and the length of the buffet. And we can just look at, okay, given that you've picked something in the past order, what's the likelihood that the next thing you do is in order? Okay, so we'll have one statistic there. We're going to pool across all the events to do that. And then this is an interesting one. This is, I think, the first time we've ever used this. We actually have a derivation in the Journal of Statistical Software paper that shows that you can do this we're going to have a clock event, okay, that strikes when the next to last thing is a drinking. So what did I say about the order of the drinks are always at the end, right? And so it would be really rare for someone to get in line and go, oh, I want a Coke, and then go all the way there and then have to turn around in this virtual environment and walk all the way back, okay? So what we're going to do here is a little bit of a trick. We're going to set what we're going to call a clock event. It's going to wait some time, some proportion of the time, and then it's going to strike. Okay, clock strikes, and the next question it asks is the next event a drinking event? Okay, the amount of time that it's waiting is basically proportional to about 99% of the time. So it's going to wait 99% of the history, and then it strikes, and we're asking is the next event a drinking event? Okay, we can't look to the future and say the model's myopic. We can't look into the future and say is this the event that precedes the end? No, we can't do that. We have to do this in this way. This is actually very useful if you're modeling relational events and you have temporal effects on the event, on the order of the food or of the choice selections. Okay, we're going to model this in blocks. The first block was going to be what I call block 1. It's going to evaluate whether or not the effects are present in general. This is independent of any feedback conditions. This is just a group model. We'll have 4 models. Model just the base rates for the individual hazards for selecting each event. What is this saying? This model is basically a null model. It's saying that event selection is random. Okay, I have a propensity to select any food at random. Okay, this is a nice kind of null. We can then add the behavioral statistics to that. Okay, so controlling for the overall propensities to select particular foods at different rates. What's the effect of the behavioral statistics I just mentioned? We can then add the structural to the same thing to see if those are going on, and then we'll put them all together. We'll do the same thing, okay, in block 2, but now we're going to multiply these, okay, by the experimental conditions to get the first difference between the control group and the feedback conditions, and we'll make those comparisons. We're going to do some both within and between block model comparison. We're going to do that by BIC. Okay, so descriptives. These aren't all that interesting, just showing that we're using 221. That's the number eligible of the 230 that were selected in the study. That 230, by the way, was chosen due to a power analysis that the IRB required. We would have done 500, but they said we can only do 225 or something. Average number of events, most people do about 33 events. You note that standard deviations in all these statistics are large. They're heavily right-tailed distributions, as these things are. The total amount of each simulation, okay, who knows what that is? It's like 2.5 minutes, right? So on average, folks do about minutes, but we have a large standard deviation, about a minute standard deviation here. So these are fast simulations. Moms are making these decisions very quickly. So if you were thinking about doing this with a regular selection process model, you'd be hard bet to get the dynamics out of this. So the relational event model is really appropriate here because it's very myopic. It knows what's going to happen next, but not what's going to happen in 1 hour. The mean inter-event time is about 5 seconds. Okay, so choices are made between events about 5 seconds. Now that doesn't really reflect the inertial effects. Okay, this is the inter-event time between making one choice versus another. Mothers are equally distributed among each experimental condition, so that's no surprise. And all of our robustness checks, they're all the randomization work. Okay, so let's look at block 1. I'm going to show you the base rates. The next slide, on the y-axis, you're going to see the food choices, and on the x-axis, okay, so this is like a Bayesian style plot. The x-axis, you're going to see the log hazards. Okay, these are the log hazards, and all this slide shows is not all interesting, but that there is heterogeneity in the propensities to select different foods. Okay, so there's different rates to select different foods. Some foods are more attractive than others. Okay, and what do we find is that look, brownies and pudding happen later in the event history. So if you took the e to this thing, the inverse of e to this thing, so the negative e to that, what you get, right, is the exponential waiting time to the first event, okay, in relational event speak. So brownies happen later. Drinks, surprisingly, are about in the middle of the distribution. So some people really are going to get a drink and then coming back. That was unexpected. But we get things like grapes, which happen in the middle. They're very likely to occur. So this, by the way, these rates take into account not just the amount of time that transpires between events, but also the frequency. Okay, so it's a mixture of the time to the event and the frequency with which they arise. Not all that interesting. So let's move on to the statistics. So this is block 1. sure I'm on time, plenty of time. Can you shut your So I'll erase to this model. So here's, so we just saw the results from model 1. This is the behavior model, this is the structure model, this is the combined model. These, again, are the multipliers, okay, for the hazards. So these are rate multipliers for the hazards of selecting each one of these conditions. Browsers, and then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to highlight the significant effects. So these are the Bayesian equivalent, okay, of a frequentist p-value of being less than 0.05. Okay, so these are, think of these as having an alpha level of 0.05. So for browsers, let's pay attention to model 2 here. What we are seeing is that this is in absolute terms, a larger negative value, right? And so what that suggests is that browsers, compared to their non-browsing components, are taking longer to make their first bad decision. Okay, so the conformists, okay, for whatever reason, okay, are going to pick brownies more quickly than browsers will. And then relatively, okay, browsers are making their, so if you look within these, this number is a smaller number compared to this one, and so that means that they're making their good decisions, even though they're taking longer to make those decisions, we expect that, they're making their good decisions quicker than their bad decisions. For good to bad food choice, we don't see what our hypothesis was, all right? So we actually find a negative effect on, so given that you've selected from the choices involved in making good selections, the likelihood that you'll select a bad thing next actually goes down, okay? The rate of that selection goes down. But we do see some evidence of the plate building exercise, okay? So the plate building exercise, these are all large, fairly large effects, but we don't get the higher order triadic and quartic effects here. We're getting really just transitional effects. So from protein to veg, veg to starch, starch to dessert, inseparable. But when you combine them, we don't see any evidence that that's going on. These long chain sequences are rare. The caloric effect, as you might expect, this is actually less than that number. I couldn't appropriately fit the less than sign here without making the slide look crappy. So this is actually less than that number. Now, what is that? This is 1 unit increase in the total amount of calories that you previously accumulated affects the rate at which you make the next selection. So we expect this number to be really tiny. That's why I'm not happy with how it's operationalized. It's significant. For model 2, we have very, very strong structural effects. So this is like, given that you've selected some food choice in the past, the next thing that you're going to do is selected with e to that number, so it's like 40 times the rate, okay, 40 times the hazard, 40 times the hazard. Partial ordering effects are also significant, okay, and guess what? When we put these models in together, we basically lose almost all the partial ordering effects that we observed due to the plate building exercise, including the good to bad. So these effects can be fully attributed really to just the structure of the buffet. We still retain starch to dessert. So people pick potatoes and then they pick dessert. I don't have any just so explanation of why that happens, but it happens here with relatively great frequency. I want to point out that the best fitting model here is model 4. Yes?
So is it like a skip to end? Like if they met like...
Right, so maybe like I'm done, I'm going to go to the dessert, and right? But the partial order would have taken that into account.
I'm just wondering, you mean like if they accidentally find themselves taking potatoes, then they're just like, oh, neither was dessert.
Okay, can you hold that to the end?
Yeah.
Hold that thought to the end. I have an answer to that. It's at the end. Okay, so here, right now, we're on the scale of the hazards. So here's the hazards, here are the food choices, and here are the rates, relative rates, okay, for control in the two feedback conditions. And I'm gonna de-highlight all of the non-significant effects here. We can see that, okay, there are differences by feedback condition. There aren't many with relative rates, okay? However, I want to point out that consistent with the main outcome paper, there's no real distinction about whether or not these are healthy or unhealthy foods, okay? So they're, again, consistent with that idea that folks are just selecting, they are making different choices, but they're not distinguishing between what's good and what's bad based on their feedback condition. For example, we have, hey, good, behavioral risk information, they're selecting more grapes than control, okay, at a faster rate, they're selecting grapes at a faster rate, I should say. But they're also selecting more mac and cheese at a faster rate, so it's not really a distinction that we can roughly say. So let's look at results from block 2. So here are our model. This is model 1, model 2, model 3, and these are just the first differences in the effects compared to the from the control group. I'll again highlight the significant effects, and what we find, okay, now what's interesting for the we have differential effects, okay, differential differences from control once these things are all together, working all together in a model, between the feedback conditions. Okay, so we actually observe in just the behavioral model higher order propensities. So we have protein, veg, starch. The next event is starch with greater propensity, but not very likely that the next thing that follows that, okay, is going to be dessert. No such significant effect in the FHH condition, but we do see that FHH browsers, mothers who receive FHH plus BRI are more quick, okay, to arrive at, not more quick, they are slower to arrive at bad decisions. Okay, don't know, that's probably good. And what we find is that they are also more likely to make this transition from good to bad relative to the relatively low frequency that the control condition made. And then we get this basically this interesting mixed effect for the caloric take. Okay, so here the BRI is actually operating even slower than control, and the FHH, again, imagine that there's an arrow, less than sign here, are operating even faster, a little bit faster, significantly faster than control. Don't know why. Structural effects, as we hypothesized, for the most part, they're not significantly different than control, except the FHH data is prohibitively less likely, okay, to engage in that inertial effect. So they're selecting, this is a rate multiplier, right? And so what's happening is that they're not as susceptible to the effects of the portion size. So what are they doing? They're monitoring their portion size, right? They're not going to, they take P's and they think, okay, I've had enough. I'm going to move on to something else. The portion size is effective. Put them all together, we basically lose the most of the effects as before, except that portion size effect remains, the caloric effect remains, and for the behavioral behavioral risk information, we retain those effects in the full model. Okay. Again, the full model is preferred within this block. However, if you were paying attention, if I want to know whether or not the feedback conditions are really having an effect here, I should compare between blocks, right? So what we can find is that from our modeling perspective, that almost always, in fact always, in all the permutations I did for these statistics, the simplicity of block 1 is preferred over block 2. So we said, okay, well, wait a minute. What if we're interested in what the absolute effect sizes are for the feedback conditions? What would we do? Well, a naive thing to do is simply eliminate any place in the model where there's no significant difference between control, because it's fully accounted for by control, right? So if we do that, we basically prune that model. Okay, I'm not saying this is the theoretical thing to do. This is the empirical thing that you would do. We can still contain observed significant differences in 20 out of the 60 statistics, and that's the model that's preferred by BAC. This is not a simulated annealer. This is not a stepwise regression. All I did was say, okay, I'm going to drop anything that wasn't significant, and that was a contrast between control and feedback condition. And that's the model that we resolve on. Okay, so back to the research question. Time. To what extent do feedback conditions modify choice selection? Well, to some extent. Okay, so I think we have, I hope that I convinced you, we have conditional partial support for all of the hypotheses that we propose, all of our intuitions about what might be going on. And I do think the exceptions are interesting here. So, for example, the family FH, the most strong feedback condition with the FHH isn't as susceptible to the portion size induced inertia. That's actually quite interesting. It means that something behavioral is going on with them. Low level. And so, what have we learned? Okay, well, first of all, I think that we've shown both in the primary outcome paper and in this behavioral process that obesity information, obesity risk information, can modify mother's meal selection choices, and it can modify the behavioral process by which they arrive at those choices to some extent. Both the structural and behavioral processes are at play, okay, but the structure the structural statistics tend to drive a lot of the event history. So once you put the structural statistics in, we lose a lot of the effects from those behavioral things. Things are food ordering really matters here. As far as the feedback conditions, okay, they differ in some food choice selections, but not a lot. They're not distinguishing between healthy and unhealthy foods. They differ in some behavioral processes. They definitely differ in the caloric monitoring. That is an unusual effect, and I want to probe that more. And certainly, as I just mentioned, with the inertial tendencies, okay, we noted that the rate of inertia is much slower for the BRI FHH than control, and the BRI plus FHH plates fill up at a slower rate, okay, than control, while the BRI plates fill up faster. If you have any intuition about why that might be the case, please let me know. It's not in the lid. We also note that within blocks, more complex models are preferred, but between blocks, models are just barely preferred. So we might have some room here to do some really interesting model selection, say with the simulated annealer. I'd like to improve on just doing the naive thing, just dropping the non-significant effects. So note that this is, again, still a work in progress, and I've got some things that I want to do. Back to your question. So remember, you were asking, okay, what if they've realized, okay, I've just got enough potatoes, and now, to get dessert, or whatever, or they're just filling up. You can put back things in this world, okay? You can put stuff back. It's rare. It's less than 7% of all the events, okay? They actually enter into this model, but not in the way that I would normally do. So normally I would have what we call a support constraint in the model that says when events are possible and when they're not. So you can only put a potato back if you've taken a potato, right? So we can put that in there. That's what I want to do. But for this talk, I hadn't actually thought about that. This is why, again, it's a work in progress. But it actually enters into the equation when it comes to the caloric statistic, okay? Because if they put stuff back, then the plate has gone down in calories at that next event, not gone up, okay? And so maybe a hint about what might be going on with the FHH being a little bit slower feedback condition in terms of caloric fill-up is maybe those moms are just putting stuff back more frequently. Okay, so that could be going on. I haven't looked at it, and that's where I really want to go. So we're going to incorporate that in the next step. Right now it's limited. It's rare. It's less than 7% of the events. There's 2,000 something events in the full model, so it's not a lot. But it is going on, and it might be going on based on feedback conditions. I want to have a more evidence-based characterization of food type. I don't think we're doing a good job of categorizing what's good and what's bad. Meg Goldring and Colin McBride are responsible for doing that. I don't. You tell me. They use another model with 3 categories of go, slow, and woe foods. Okay, go meaning you can take them, slow meaning take them on occasion, and woe meaning avoid these foods. Turns out that if you categorize in that way, basically there's no differences between the slow and the woe foods. So why not just put them together into bad foods? That's what I did. I also want to fix this calorie count effect in part because of this. Okay? I think that what I'd like to do instead is to borrow from Carter's original model, okay, and take what's called a recency effect. Okay, so here I want the fraction, instead of doing this as a cumulative sum, I can look at the fraction of the past caloric intake to affect the future selection rates. So this is a slightly different operationalization. It will certainly correct the bias of that statistic being tiny all the time and hard to interpret. And then we've got additional endogenous covariates. So this is a virtual reality world, and for those of you who work in these worlds, you get all kinds of data, right? So I have head tracking data, I have gaze, I know where they're gazing, I know when they make utterances. Some of them actually narrate their story as they go, like, oh, I'm going to get some peas, and now I'm going to get some tater tots. But that information might actually have been important here, and we're not incorporating that at all. We also have some exogenous events where moms get stuck in a voxel, so they're literally their avatar gets stuck in the buffet, and when they move back, they can kind of see their avatar. It freaks them out. So that's an exogenous event because the collaborator has to reset their avatar to be back in the right space. So we can incorporate that. And we're also really interested in more behavior. So the plate building behavior, while it was empirically informed as something that could be going on, we don't find much evidence of that net, after controlling for the structural effects. There might be some other things that we can incorporate. I don't know what they are. If you have ideas, I'd be happy to entertain them. Thank you. Sip of water. Yes.
I was wondering where you came up with that, the order hypothesis that good
choices perceived bad ones. Is that from self-control?
Right. So there's in the Wilcox paper, they're actually looking at self-control, the locus of control theories, and what they're saying is actually their findings are actually the exact opposite of the Wansing findings in the same topic, where basically the presence of healthier foods were driving people to make healthier choices. And they were showing, no, wait, actually, after you've taken out some structure, some ordering effects in the model, people will, if you tempt them with dessert, they will take dessert, but only if you have lots of healthy options to choose from first. So it's like locus of control. It's classic locus of control stuff, but the result is just in the lit. So that's what we picked stuff that we could find in the lit.
Follow-up question. Did you, excuse me, and the screening process, screen for not just unhealthy body weight, but eating disorders?
Yes. So, I won't go back to the flow chart, but there were several exclusion criteria. One of the exclusion criteria was underlying disease. Okay, so they could not be depressed at a certain level. They could not have a clinical diagnosis for certain. We want basically the population going in are basically homogeneous, almost entirely. These are people who show up at the clinical center at the NIH, so they're more wealthy, they're more educated, and this is typical of that. So homogeneous population, no underlying disease. Yes?
This is really interesting. I was curious about the level which your model is.
Mm-hmm.
So is it on the level of the item, or is it the level of the scoop? So is it like 20 seconds until I go to carrots, or is it 20 seconds until I do scoop of carrots and then 1 second until the next scoop? So
It's on the level of the event, okay? And so when they click that button, that's the next event, okay? And it's like they don't have to do the scoop themselves. The scoop is kind of semi-animated. It just like appears on their plate. Yeah.
So what does that mean for your model? So is it, sorry, I actually don't understand that, but is it on the level of the carrot? Like I go to carrots, or I scoop of carrots, and then the next event is a second scoop of carrots?
Right, so the event is whenever they've clicked that button to make the choice selection, that's when the event is recorded.
Okay.
So for however long it takes for you to select carrots and then select tater tots, that is the inner event time. That's what's governing the rates.
If you do 2 scoops of carrots, is that 2 events?
So that's 2 events. The
Okay.
carrot, that's the inertial effect.
Okay.
That's the whole point of that inertial effect, because what we were noticing is that since the portion size, and this is not something that they would have known in the design. Okay, this is something that we detected using the model. We saw after the experiment, like, why are people just like standing there picking carrots over and over? Well, it's because even though they're proxying for their child, they're acting like human rational actors, like, oh, this is a small portion, I need another scoop. And they're trying to fill that plate up. And that's actually where we get into some of that putback behavior, like, oh, wait a minute, I filled up this plate because it's a structural limitation. The plate size is real. Okay, you can't put infinite choices here. It will fill up eventually, and once it's filled up, that's it. You got to exit simulation or put things back. And so we actually see that most of the putback events are actually endogenous with that inertial effect. So it's like I put oh wait, I've got too much. Now I'm going to put something back. By the way, if you've ever put stuff back on a buffet, that's disgusting. So this is not a real event. This is really the environment. Okay. Oh, just break my plate back off. Don't eat these beets. Yes.
Couple questions. So first, when you said all the event times are recorded just when they click their button, right? So with like the time between events, that doesn't really account for what they're doing in the time between the events, right?
Right. So remember, we have a latent Cox proportional hazard model, right? So what does that mean?
Are you asking me?
Yes.
About a proportionate hazard model?
So this is the inter-event times are governed by a latent proportional hazards model. So what does that mean?
That means at any time between
Nothing happened. That's what it means. We assume nothing happens.
Right, the likelihood of the next event is the same as it was
Exactly.
a second before.
Yeah. So yes, they could have been doing other things in the interim. We don't record it. We have the information, so we know whether or not they moved, right? We know
Right.
that
Well, because
stuff.
I was asking, because I'm wondering if it's different if you're just sitting there staring at the peas, or if you're wandering around looking,
Right.
because those aren't reported, but those are probably different behaviors.
Right, absolutely, and we have that recorded, so we'll know like how long there's. Of course, what's the typical the typical event history is lasting 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes. So they're not standing still for very long, but we can get subtleties. And actually, a lot of the work that Susan Persky, one of the collaborators, done has been analyzing the subtleties of these types of behaviors. And the subtleties, I wouldn't have guessed this as a sociologist going in. The subtleties actually have bigger impacts on main outcome than you think. Like utterances. People who talk through their meal, I think they pick lower plate choices. Why? I don't know. But however, I want to point out that we can actually, so even though we have a latent proportional hazards model, it's basically governing the rates, inter-event rates, we can have covariates on the event. So the caloric one is a dynamic covariate, but it only changes when the events transpire. So if things happen in the interim, we can still handle that by just making an assumption that they happened when the events transpire. Okay, so we can have a statistic that says, or another way to do it is we can have more clock events. So we can break up everything into tiny, tiny little fragments and just have a clock event firing all the time. That's going to increase the complexity of the model, but it will get at exactly that. So you can say, okay, at this nanosecond, are they still looking? At this nanosecond, are they still looking? At this nanosecond, are they still looking? Or they made a choice. And we can do that. That's actually that clock event stuff. This is the first time I've presented anything on that. It turns out that in this case, it's not all that important. But it's very powerful in the relational events framework. You can use it to incorporate, to slice up your data in a way that allows you to model inter-event periods, because from the model's perspective, that clock event is an event. Clock strikes, okay, that's an event. Sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes.
So I don't know a lot about this
Sure.
type of research, buffet.
Yeah, I don't know either.
I'm just curious, like, since in the model, the structural events seem to, or parameters, play more of a role than behavioral.
Yeah.
Like, what's the policy implication outside of?
Oh, this is great. So this basically validates what Weinstein's proposals, and actually Jamie Oliver, the chef, he's like saying this stuff too, but he doesn't have any data. He's just saying, when I watch kids at buffet, I notice that they pick the first foods first, so let's put all the healthy choices first.
Sure.
Okay. The other thing is that we could just endogenously avoid unhealthy food selection, right? But there's a couple of things that we can't do. If you change the size of the spoon, that's not going to, one of the things that we're finding, that's not going to matter. People just they'll just fill up the plate. So smaller plates might work, but also food ordering effects, if they really are, as we've shown and consistent with the past lit, it really suggests that if you want to have a mixture of unhealthy and healthy foods, having encouraging browsing helps, okay, and making sure that the healthier food selections come first help. That's there. Second.
So with the calorie metric that you have,
Yeah.
so you say the structural limitation, right, is the size of the plate.
Yep.
So maybe, unless the calories are actually posted, so they know
They
how
don't.
many calories are on the plate.
They're only approximated through portion size.
Because with the baseline model, you said they really have no ability to pick healthier items,
Right.
regardless of the control. So they might not even know how many calories are in.
Right, but they're doing somehow, at the end of the day, the feedback conditions from the original outcomes paper, somehow they're arriving at fewer calories. The only way they can be doing that is if they're selecting less food.
Well, right, but it makes me wonder how correlated that is
Mm.
with just proportion of the plate that's already full.
You know, that might be another way to get at that instead. So so we just do the fraction. We could
Right.
model this instead of the cumulative calories, just the fraction of the plate surface that's filled.
Yeah.
That might work. In fact, it should be. Well, no, it's not correlated. It's not intrinsically correlated
It
because
doesn't have to be.
right, because you could pick peas which have basically no calories in this world. I mean,
But from a perception standpoint, it
Right.
might be correlated.
right, yeah. Because they don't know the underlying calories. All they know is the portion size. Yes.
I think you just answered my question, but it was in jargon. So,
But they have knowledge. I mean, most people have knowledge of like approximately how much calories are in food. So how can you be sure that the only thing that they're going on is portion?
They don't know what the exact caloric content is. So the only thing that we know that they could be observing, okay, is that they're guessing, or they have some knowledge, or for everybody, it's that they're monitoring portion size. That's our guess, but we don't know it exactly. So there's no test, there's no survey interview to gather their food knowledge, which might have
Which
been.
could have been, which could have
Yeah.
been done, to just get a sense of their literacy of food
Yeah.
before.
There is a health literacy module that they filled out. So that might be good.
So you all should continue.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I've
You gotta
gone to a
teach.
faculty senate, and before teaching, I have to go sit in the faculty senate meeting for 50 minutes now, and then I'll come back and teach my class at 6. But I'm going to say thanks to you,
Thanks.
but you all should continue the conversation here, so see you folks later.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Sorry.
Keep going. Yes.
I want to get insights on how you interpret the dependent variable, or rather like their construal of the dependent variable. People were asked to create a plate that represents their typical
Typical
meal.
kids meal.
Yeah. And so I can see it kind of like being interpreted a few ways. Like what's happening is it could be a recall task for people where you're inducing motivated reasoning
Mm-hmm.
to kind of make people recall something that makes themselves look a little bit better in their eyes, sort of like an esteem buffer. That is, you give people this history of themselves, you're awful at this, and you're at risk for this.
Yep.
People's self-esteem decreases,
Mhm.
and so their recall is motivated to, buffer against it and say, I'm not that bad.
Yep.
Another way to kind of like see it is perhaps it could be a shame inducement,
I'm so glad you said that.
where, people are shamed and they're being evaluated and they do not want to look bad in front of these researchers.
Yep.
So it's social desirability.
So,
And the other way is sort of more promising, maybe it's behavioral intention, that you have essentially done a fear
or both.
appeal. That's right, these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. You could have done a fear appeal where you scare people into a potential outcome, and so they're taking the steps needed to
Remedy that.
To remedy
But
that.
this is long term too. So remember, they're receiving this for several weeks in the past, receiving feedback several weeks in the past, and then we're asking them to modify the plate or to build the plate in the future. So there's, as we know, that the fear induction.
That's exactly
stuff,
right. It needs to be temporarily
Yeah.
approximate.
But I'm so glad you mentioned the shame part, because actually in the post-buffet assessment, they were given a standard psychometric assessment after the fact, because two of the four of us were psychologists, and the other two was psychologists, although Megan's becoming a psychologist. So what we found was that the mothers, and this is another paper that Susan is writing right now, the mothers who were given the family health history felt more guilt. So even though they were sort of framed as it's not your fault, this is part of your genetics, they felt guilty about that. So it induced this sort of shame thing, which turns out may be really good to motivate people for behavioral change. And there's a whole bunch of theories that says that it's not, right? That shame is actually makes, reinforces the sort of shameful behavior. But in this case, it seems to be that the genetic information, the genomic information about the rise of family health history is actually doing something different, making them feel they're feeling more guilty about their condition and about their influence on their child's health, but it's also making them choose more healthy looking plates. So I think you're 100% correct in that the mechanisms that are underlying the cognitive processes that give rise to differentiation and feedback conditions are, I think, are many. I definitely think the shame one is there. I don't think the fear model would work in this situation because it's so distal from the actual intervention.
To follow up with that then, if shame is a normative sort of response, or it's a sort of evaluative sort of response where you don't want to be evaluated negatively, does that imply that if people are given these sort of messages, but they're doing it in a context outside of evaluation, would you expect?
Could you still induce the effect?
That's right.
That's I don't know. I would, so what we know about genomic risk information is that most of the time people don't know how to interpret it. And so they just say, oh, it runs in your family, and so we can't do anything about it. But there's a whole lit on the there's a whole psychometric lit basically on just how to measure that. But secondarily, on more to the point, there's a lit on interpreting intent after giving genomic information. Thank you. Thank you. Did you have a question? No. Thank you. Right, so there's a whole lit on interpreting what people do with that information. A lot of the time, it does induce emotions and dysregulation associated with fears and anxiety about disease. Okay, but it often also gives some different folks, it's another factor, and they're orthogonal too. I'm thinking of the work of Bob Biesecker here. The genomic information gives people a sense of relief when there's some unknown underlying cause of disease in the family. That's not the case here, right? Here, it's pretty clear that what causes obesity, we know what causes it, right? It's an imbalance in the caloric ratio and with some genetic factors, okay? So that can't be the case. It has to be operating through what we think is going on is that they feel shameful, that they have perhaps a lifestyle that is giving rise to conditions that might influence their child's health, plus it runs in the family. So it's like a double burden effect. It's like, oh, not only am I making bad decisions, but I'm like, I can't help the fact that we are genetically predisposed to have a slower metabolism. Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not a theoretician, or not a psych one.
It's interesting questions that arise.
Anyone else? Yes.
Well, and on that idea of theorization, the questions I have are less related to the experiment. On buffet selection, how accurate do you think this virtual experiment of buffet selection is to actual food choices? And in regards to that, because I guess most parents aren't doing a buffet for their child every day,
Right.
Did you consider factoring in price of the good versus the bad, and to see if that is
They were told this is a free lunch, okay? So
Right.
even though strangely there's a teller at the end, there's a free lunch right at the pay at the end. They're told it's a free lunch, right? So they don't have to pay. It's sort of a simulated world. I think more importantly is that this is not so even though they're constructing a typical plate, this is not a typical food preparation experience for most moms or dads, for that matter. You're right, they're not going through the food selection process in a buffet every day. But if they were, okay, this model, the simulation, in the environment they built was highly empirically validated, right? So they did a lot of really good legwork in getting this to look right, to getting the food order right. This is like, they have I forget what they're called, but the sort of mushy stuff on one side, and the more appealing stuff on one side, that is something that was a design consideration. Having the drinks at the end was a design consideration. And so the experience should approximate any real world experience that they would have, building a plate by proxy for their kid in a buffet situation. There's some work on actual buffet, real world simulated buffets where there's fake food. Okay, people do this. Okay, this is like a real world simulation where there's a buffet with fake food and they have mom go through and do this. And basically the results are consistent with what they found in the outcome studies. So it may not approximate real life, but it's approximating the real world.
What about the issue of price, though?
I don't know. I can't tell you. We were told it was free. They were told it was free. What do you think? I think
that they're going to be more inclined to choose the more affordable food, because I think in the beginning of your presentation you said that socioeconomic status was a huge issue in obesity.
No, well, in obesity it is, although it is improving. Oddly enough, obesity rates, prevalence are improving faster for lower income than they are for upper. But why is that? Well, it's a thresholding effect, right? They're the most at risk, so they have the furthest to go to gain, right, to improve. But price. So most, and correct me if I'm wrong, most buffets are weight scale, right? So the food is going to be priced not on the individual item selection. It's not a la carte, right? So if it was a la carte, we'd expect them price select. We'd expect choices to anchor on the more affordable options in, assuming that price isn't a problem for this group. It's not. These are relatively middle income folks. However, in this case, and you can actually see in the simulation that they actually built the scale. Where's the little clicker? It's right here. The scale into the model. Let's see if I can find it. Can you see it there? Yeah, you can see it there. Register. So, you know what? They don't have it. I think that in the next phase they have a scale that sits here. So you set the tray there, and then you click the woman at the end of the line, and she checks you out from your free meal.
So it supports, it perfectly emulates the buffet style. But I guess it just goes back to the first question then, in terms of are
Yeah.
people's food selections in buffets completely different than
Than say going and
the
paying out
grocery
card.
store? Yeah.
And they probably are. Well, first of all, in a grocery store, you have many more options.
Right.
So that there's that. So there's not just, and you have within category price differences within each option, right? So you can go to Whole Paycheck or Trader Joe's, right? And you're going to find that you're going to have options within both stores, and that the price differences from the tier of food that you're selecting from, say from I don't know what you call them, national brands or local, are going to be very different. Let's say for just apples than if you just had one option at Trader Joe's, which is just California grown apples or whatever. So I think that you're correct in that price will influence the food selection process. But even if it does, the feedback conditions that we have here, okay, should still be modifying the process by which the behavioral process, selection choice process, net of any price differences, right? So you should still see, okay, within the category of cheap foods, okay, there's still an inertial tendency, for example. There's still a plate building exercise. Okay, yeah, I can't go and get the grilled chicken, but I can get the chicken nuggets, okay? And I can't get maybe the asparagus, but I can get the string beans, okay? So even if it's having an effect, it's not having an effect here, but even if it's having an effect in the real world, the behavior processes that give rise to the plate at the end of the day should be differentiable by the feedback conditions that should be shown. There. Is that a good answer?
Yeah, no, thanks.
Just made it up off the top of my head. Yes?
Yeah, there's a methodological question. Is it possible to make those selection events dynamic? I mostly think about try to apply something.
These are dynamic.
I mean the choice set.
Oh, can the choice set evolve?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and the show here. Okay. Let's see, where do I mention that? Okay, so with this put back behavior, okay, we can actually change at every single event. We can change the choice set. We can have things. So as long as we know what the total choice set is, at every single moment in the model, we can say what's available for selection.
That's good. So it's similar to the Sienna model, those external, like they can inject new persons or something. Well, I mostly think about to use it in the scenario we discussed before.
Right.
But for this one, I think it could be useful to model the browser effect. So basically, if you are a browser, you have a complete choice set. But if you are not a browser,
Oh, yes, so it's a different way, right? So you say, okay, right, so that's great. Although, just to be clear, if we did that, then we'd have to make a separate model for browsers and for non-browsers. Here, they're pooled together,
okay.
right? Because
The
the
shot
choice.
is a global, not individual to the person.
Right,
Okay.
exactly, yeah. But we could, but actually, so, and this is, if you're using my tools, and the tools that Carter developed, you'll note that we can specify what we call global and local statistics. Those are basically fixed effects and random effects.
Right.
Okay, this is the type of model. So I can actually fit this whole thing individually for every single person, and then look at the distribution of
And then if you
parameters instead of pulling them together.
Connect with your data, you can actually model where they looked, and then pick the choices
Mm-hmm.
in the site of life or something.
Yeah,
That's more realistic.
Well, I don't know if it's more realistic. I mean, it's a different approximation. I think actually the browsing, I'm actually happy with that statistic because what it says is, okay, I have an exogenous covariate, okay, that I observed in another scenario, and I'm just saying that that's a fixed covariate. You're either a browser or not, and what that covariate, how it's parameterized, is by how long it took you to make your first decision in that previous previous simulation. And so, with the hypothesis that past behavior predicts your future behavior. That you'll, again, make those, and we find an effect, and the effect is non-trivial. And so, I think that we've made a good choice with that browsing statistic. If I were to reparameterize it in the way that you're saying, I think I probably would do the separable case, where we model we do a pooled model for browsers and a pooled model for non-browsers, and then we can use, test of coefficient differences to look at the difference across the set, that would be a fine way to do it. I actually like the idea that, because what you're saying is that if you're a conformist, you're just looking right here.
Yeah.
But if you're a browser, you're looking here. And so the problem is that, the problem with that is that you have to be very careful how you set the statistics up, because you don't want to limit the choice sets when you don't want to limit the choice set for events that are possible.
Right.
So if it was at all possible for a non-browser to go to the end of the line and come back and or wait, in
So
that
that's why I try
simulation.
to model what they looked before.
Yeah.
Expand the choice set gradually based on their travel.
Well, actually, we can do that in a different way. We can actually write a statistic that says we can write statistics for any subsequence of events here. So we can actually write down
Right.
just what you're saying and model it directly instead of with the latent thing by controlling this choice set.
Right.
That's latent, right?
Yeah.
The actor doesn't get to see that happen. But we can model it directly with a fixed effect, for example, for just the rate at which a browser selects a particular food choice in the order. So it's like an interaction between the browsing variable and the partial ordering variable. We can do that.
I want to go back to something you mentioned like 60 seconds ago about
I'm very myopic.
pooling all of the data together and running one model versus running it individually. Like, did you look at that, or like what is the justification for that, and are there scenarios wherein like that wouldn't make sense?
So I did separable models for each feedback condition. I compared the statistics. I determined that there were no differences between them, and I put them all together in one model. I did not look at individuals, each individual's mother's event histories separately. Why would I do that? Well, if this were a network, I would want to do that. This here, I don't have a lot of variance. If I look, so the mean number of events is, 40 or so events, and they spend about 2.5 or 3 seconds in the model, or in the simulation. If I looked at just one event history, I'm not going to have enough power to detect any signal at all,
Yeah, I was gonna say.
right?
Yeah, a lot
Because
more statistics than that.
because these are hazards, right? So what do I need for that hazard to succeed? I need to have some overall tendency for that thing to occur, okay? And if I only observe it once, well, then the survivor function is equal to the hazard, and I don't have any ability to detect what's going to happen next, let alone the overall rate for that to happen. So by pooling them together, I get the population level effects.
So, would you do similar things, like let's say you had multiple networks, and you're doing dyadic models on multiple networks, but you had no reason to believe the network?
Chris Dubois wrote,
Well, I've seen that, and
Yep.
you did like a hierarchy.
yep, so Chris Dubois did a hierarchical version of this. So basically, actually, he did the pooled estimation that I'm using Ego-Centric, but on dyadic data. But you can specify that model, and he had in his dissertation. No, that was the block model stuff. So you can actually, I believe you can actually specify sort of fixed effects and random effects in this way with the dyadic data as well. So you get like a main effect for the within group, the within network, say inertial effect, and a between group effect. I believe that's possible. It's not impossible. But Chris, he doesn't actually, I don't think he works on the family of models anymore. So there's definitely room for development there. The other Chris and Carter's not. They're working on a relation with that models. Anything else? Okay. Thank you. I hope you found this interesting.